Hello, dear German learner. How do you say I feel sick in German? Is it A, ich fühle krank, B, ich habe krank, C, ich spüre krank, or D, ich empfinde krank? Take your time. So you said A, ich fühle krank. Is that your final decision? Yes? Well, you're wrong. All the answers are wrong. The game is rigged. The correct answer is ich fühle mich krank. Want to know why that is? Let's talk about reflexive verbs. Tag an alle, my name is Florian and I've been a German teacher for almost a decade. Over the years I've had a lot of English-speaking students, and one of the topics that kept popping up was reflexive verbs, verbs with sich in front of them. And they seem intuitive enough. Germans usually confirm this by telling you, oh, it's like myself, yourself in English. But then you stumble over stuff like this. To imagine, sich vorstellen. To remember, sich erinnern. Or to memorize, sich merken. Now where the hell is that myself, yourself these people were talking about? Well, it turns out that among European languages, English is quite the odd one out. And before we get into the grammar part, I want to address this real quick. There's a reason for your discomfort about reflexive verbs and the feeling that you don't really understand them. The University of Cambridge published a study about reflexive verbs in the English language, and it says, quote, "Present-day English is generally assumed to possess only a handful of lexicalized reflexive verbs. Such middle uses of reflexive markers are widespread in other European languages," unquote. As per the Oxford Dictionary, English has only 222 reflexive verbs, whereas German has probably over 1,000. That explains the inconsistencies. Now, sorry for the long introduction, but this is rarely ever talked about. So in today's video, we'll get to the very bottom of how reflexive verbs work in German. Let's get started. What is a reflexive verb? To put it simply, a reflexive verb is a verb where the action of the subject reflects back onto it, so the subject and the object are the same. Now, this is wildly simplified, but I'll give you the necessary information to get started. So, how do reflexive verbs look like in German? You can identify a reflexive verb by the little sich that comes before it, mostly in the infinitive. So, for example, hören, to hear, is a normal verb, while sich hören, to hear oneself, is a reflexive one. Now, this sich is called a reflexive pronoun, and these pronouns always accompany the verb. Since English has no cases, reflexive pronouns are limited to myself, yourself, himself, herself, itself, ourselves, yourselves, and themselves. That's a bit different in German. Here, reflexive pronouns can either take the accusative or dative case. Not the genitive though, so you can stop worrying about that one. And I have more good news for you. If you've already studied personal pronouns, which I've covered in this video right here, reflexive pronouns will be super easy for you. So, let's check them out. For ich, du, wir, and ihr, it's basically the same table as for personal pronouns. Ich, mich, mir, du, dich, dir, wir, uns, ihr, euch. No change at all. You only need to learn new pronouns for the third person singular and plural. Or should I rather say one new pronoun, sich. And that's the whole table. Congratulations. Keep in mind that you only really need to think about the accusative or dative cases if you use a reflexive verb with ich or du, since these are the only ones where the forms actually differ. All the other ones are the same. Anyway, let's get straight to the burning question, when do you have to use which case? Well, it's pretty trivial, you just need to know by heart, but don't worry. Most of the time it's the accusative, and there are a few tricks you can utilize. More on that later. Let's first get into the reflexive verb groups. Now, I usually separate them into 3 different categories. These aren't official by any means, those are way more complicated, but rather optimized for English natives and speakers. Let's start with the first and easiest group. Verbs that can be both normal and reflexive, and where the reflection is just redirecting the action back to the subject. Sounds harder than it is, so here are a few examples. Ich sehe ihn, I see him. Ich sehe mich, I see myself. Er fragt sie, he asks her. Er fragt sich, he asks himself. Du bewegst es, you're moving it. Du bewegst dich, you're moving. If you translate these verbs to English, you're most likely to get a reflexive pronoun as well. English verbs like to move, as in to change location, are already intransitive, so you don't need the reflexive pronoun. But watch out, Germans tend to use verbs from this category in a reciprocal sense as well. Now what the hell does that mean? Let me demonstrate that by using 2 sentences. They love themselves means that there are people who are either self-absorbed or really in tune with their own body. This is a reflexive meaning. They love each other means that there is a group, usually 2, who mutually loves the other member or members of that group. This is reciprocity. Now in German, we also have a word for each other, einander. So they love each other is translated to sie lieben einander. Great. Well, we don't really say that too often in real life. We actually just use the reflexive verb sich lieben and let context do the rest. So sie lieben sich has both meanings. Here are a few more examples. Sie küssen sich. Either they kiss themselves or they kiss each other. Here, the pure awkwardness of kissing yourself does the context for you. Sie verstehen sich gut. Either they understand themselves well or they understand each other well. And if you understand the wishes and desires of another person, you usually get along. So, sich verstehen mit is also to get along with somebody in English. I think you get the point. There is one more thing to say about this category. As you know by now, the accusative is used to reflect the action back to the subject. The subject will then turn into the direct object. Ich wasche is I wash, ich wasche mich, I wash myself. There's a rule though where you can put the reflexive pronoun in the dative, which then turns the subject into the receiver of the action. Something like for oneself or for one's own sake. By doing that, you free up space for a direct object. So instead of ich wasche mich, you'd say ich wasche mir, like in the sentence ich wasche mir die Hände. Now in English, y'all don't really use reflexive pronouns this way, and this sentence would still be I wash my hands, although there might be some British dialects that actually make use of this. Maybe I wash myself my hands or something like that. If you are a speaker of such a dialect, let me know in the comments. Anyway, this type of construction is used very frequently in German. Here are some examples with a somewhat direct translation. Ich putze mir die Zähne, I brush myself my teeth. Ich föhne mir die Haare, I blow dry myself my hair. Or ich koche mir eine Suppe, I cook myself a soup. Keep that in mind. Category 2 consists of verbs that can be both normal and reflexive, but they will then have different meanings. This might be the group that is most confusing for people learning German. Sometimes, if you redirect the action of the original verb back to the subject, you might be able to see the connection of why it is translated the way it is. For example, erinnern means to remind, but sich erinnern means to remember. Ich erinnere dich an ihren Geburtstag, I'll remind you of her birthday. Ich erinnere mich an ihren Geburtstag, I remember her birthday. I mean, it's kinda logical. If you remind yourself of something, you remember. Of course, sich erinnern also includes the meaning of to remind oneself, for those of you who were wondering about that. But while there are many pairs like this one, we also have a huge number of verbs that completely change their meaning when put into their reflexive form. Such as unterhalten, to entertain, sich unterhalten, to talk, to chatter, merken, to notice, sich merken, to memorize, verlassen, to leave, sich verlassen, to rely on, ausziehen, to move out, sich ausziehen, to get undressed. Yeah, you definitely need to be careful with these. The third and last category consists of verbs that are always reflexive. You have to use a reflexive pronoun, otherwise the verb just won't make any sense. Some examples include, but are not limited to, sich beeilen, to hurry, sich ausruhen, to rest, sich beschweren, to complain, sich verirren, to get lost. So make sure to always include sich or its corresponding form when using these verbs. Now you might have noticed that I was very consequent, almost stringent, with the case of the reflexive pronoun. And that is for good reason. Getting the case right decides over the meaning of the verb. Let's use sich vorstellen as an example. Vorstellen itself just means to introduce, but once you make it reflexive, using the right case is important. Sich in the accusative, vorstellen plus dative, means to introduce oneself to somebody, very much as expected. For example, ich stelle mich der Jury vor. I will introduce myself to the jury. Don't forget to separate vor and put die Jury in the dative. However, sich in the dative, vorstellen plus accusative, means to imagine something. So the phrase ich stelle mir die Jury vor, with the dative reflexive pronoun and die Jury in the accusative, means I imagine the jury, what they look like or what they might say. Don't forget that you can only see the difference in the reflexive pronouns for ich and du. Finally, let's get to some example sentences, but before we do that, I should briefly talk about the position of reflexive pronouns in a sentence. You've probably learned about the first position, taking any information you'd like to emphasize, then the verb, and after that, the third position. Now, reflexive pronouns, as well as personal pronouns, are placed immediately after the verb, following the pronoun-noun case hierarchy. What is this hierarchy? Well, it's incredibly simple. You use pronouns before nouns. In pronouns, the accusative takes priority. In nouns, the dative takes priority. Done. So you end up with this little table. Accusative pronoun, dative noun, accusative noun. Be careful though, personal and reflexive pronouns can mix here. That means that a reflexive pronoun does not always come immediately after the verb, but let me show you. Sich in the dative, merken plus accusative. Ich merke mir dieses Wort. I'll memorize this word. Pronoun before noun. However, ich merke es mir, I'll memorize it. Accusative personal pronoun before dative reflexive pronoun. Another example. Sich in the accusative, anschließen plus dative. Ich schließe mich der Gruppe an. I'm joining this group. Again, it's just pronoun before noun. However, ich schließe mich euch an. I'm joining y'all. Mich remains in the position after the verb because it's accusative reflexive pronoun before dative personal pronoun. I hope this makes sense. But if you want to go easy on this stuff, just remember the following. The reflexive pronoun usually comes after the first verb. By the way, that is true even if the first verb is a modal verb, modifying the main verb. Ich kann mir dieses Wort nicht merken. I can't memorize this word. As you can see, reflexive verbs are not that hard at their foundation, but can get confusing if you generally have a lot of pronouns in one sentence. So if you have any questions, make sure to drop a comment and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This way you're not gonna miss the next lesson in 2 weeks. So until then, haut rein!